At 7:12 on a Wednesday morning, a woman in a white Range Rover made the single most expensive mistake of her life. She made it with a pair of bolt cutters and the unshakable confidence of someone who has never once encountered a consequence she couldn't charm or threaten her way around. The sound of that chain snapping apart was still echoing off the quiet suburban houses when her whole world started coming apart with it. My name is Darius West. I'm 39 years old, Army Reserve MP, and at the moment that chain hit the pavement, I was 7,000 miles away helping interdict drug shipments while this woman was cutting the security lock off what she believed was an annoying soldier's truck parked in a neighborhood where she had decided it didn't belong. What she did not know, what would take approximately 72 hours to become terrifyingly clear to her, was that the vehicle she was attempting to seize belonged to a federal narcotics task force. That the equipment locked inside it was worth more than her car. That the moment she touched that chain, she triggered an alert that reached 3 federal agencies before she made it back to her own driveway, and that she had just committed a federal crime serious enough to put cartel members away for years. Drop a flag emoji and tell me where you're watching from. Then stay here, because the story of how a suburban HOA president with bolt cutters became a federal defendant is one I've been waiting to tell. Grandma Eleanor bought her house in Fairview Commons in 1984, the year I was born. She raised me there after my parents were killed in a highway accident when I was 11. She taught me to do my homework at the kitchen table that smelled like coffee and whatever she had simmering on the stove. She taught me that you hold your head up in any room you walk into. She taught me that you stand up to bullies, but you do it with your brain and your documentation, not your fists. When she passed 18 months ago, she left me the house. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a backyard where she kept a garden her whole life. The deed was clean, the property taxes were current. She had been a member of the Fairview Commons HOA since the day she moved in, and had never received a single violation notice in 37 years. I received my first one 9 days after inheriting the property. The vehicle in question was a Jeep Wrangler assigned to me through the task force unit I had recently been accepted into. It carried federal law enforcement identification, clearly displayed decals that any person who dealt with law enforcement professionally would recognize immediately. I had parked it in my own driveway, in front of my own inherited home, where I had every legal right to park it. The notice cited a covenant restriction on commercial vehicles, $250 per week, accumulating while I was overseas, plus a threat of a lien on the property if the fine reached a specified amount. I want to tell you about the vehicle's contents, because they are central to what follows. The Jeep contained approximately $290,000 in classified surveillance equipment, GPS tracking systems, encrypted communication hardware, covert recording apparatus. Equipment assigned for an active narcotics investigation that could not simply be relocated without federal authorization and a documented chain of custody transfer. None of this was visible from outside the vehicle. But anyone who ran the plates or examined the federal identification displayed on the exterior would have understood immediately that they were looking at something that required a different set of conversations than a standard HOA parking dispute. The HOA president's name was Constance. Prior, she was 54 years old, real estate broker, resident of the largest home in Fairview Commons, and in her 6th consecutive year as HOA president, a tenure she referenced in conversation the way other people reference academic credentials. She drove a white Range Rover and carried a clipboard to property inspections the way a surgeon carries instruments. Purposefully, professionally, as a statement about who was in charge. My sister Jasmine, who had been keeping an eye on Grandma's house during my deployment, tried to speak with Constance the day after the first notice arrived. She showed her my deployment orders. She explained the nature of the vehicle. She offered to place a cover over it if the visual concern was the issue. Constance's response, as Jasmine reported it to me word for word in a phone call I took in a communications tent in the middle of a desert, military service is admirable, but it doesn't exempt anyone from community standards. If your brother can't maintain compliance from wherever he is, the HOA has remedies. The remedies began arriving 4 days later. Additional notices. A second vehicle mentioned my personal truck, which had been in the garage the entire time and was not visible from any public vantage point. A citation for the condition of the gutters, which Jasmine had photographs confirming were identical in condition to 6 neighboring properties, none of which received notices. A citation for the garden Grandma had kept for 37 years, now classified as unregulated vegetation. Jasmine started checking the actual HOA bylaws, the original documents Grandma had signed in 1984. This is what she found. Federal and military law enforcement vehicles were specifically excluded from the commercial vehicle restriction. They had been excluded since the original documents drafting, apparently at the insistence of a former resident who had worked for the county sheriff. The exemption was unambiguous. Constance Pryor was not enforcing existing rules. She was inventing new ones and counting on the people she targeted not to read the originals. Jasmine is a middle school history teacher. She has spent 17 years teaching young people how to identify primary sources, how to cross-reference documents, how to build an evidentiary argument. She brought all of those skills to bear on what she had found in Grandma's filing cabinet. She contacted other military families in Fairview Commons. There were 4. All 4 had received disproportionate citation activity in the preceding 3 years. A Marine's motorcycle, cited repeatedly for noise violations. A Navy spouse whose garden statuary had been characterized as creating an unprofessional aesthetic. An Air Force family whose flag display had generated 2 separate complaints about structural attachment to the property exterior. None of these items violated the original bylaws. All of them violated standards that Constance had introduced through selective interpretation without a membership vote. Jasmine began building a documentation file. This would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions anyone involved in this story made. She also filed a formal request for the HOA's financial records. In our state, homeowners have a right to examine those records upon written request. The request was denied on the first submission. Jasmine submitted a second request through certified mail with a citation to the relevant statute. This time, the records were provided. Jasmine is methodical in the way that good teachers are methodical. She went through every line. What she found in those records eventually became the foundation of a federal investigation. But that came later. The immediate development was that Constance escalated. 3 weeks after Jasmine's records request, Constance hired a private security company to conduct what she described in a community notice as a property standards compliance review. 2 men in a marked SUV began documenting my Jeep on a schedule, photographing it from multiple angles, recording the decals, noting the equipment visible through the windows. Federal task force vehicles contain automatic surveillance systems that activate when the exterior is photographed without authorization, or when the vehicle is approached within a certain proximity. I became aware of this activity because the vehicle system logged it and transmitted the alert to my supervisor, Captain Renee Holloway. Holloway is not a person who uses the word problem casually. When she called me and said the word problem, I knew the situation had moved past a nuisance HOA dispute into something that required institutional attention. She contacted federal legal counsel. The documentation of classified government surveillance equipment by private security contractors retained by a private organization without any legal authority, without any warrant, without any federal authorization constituted multiple violations under statutes that most people never encounter, because most people never do something this operationally reckless. The private security company's federal licensing was reviewed within 48 hours. The investigation that followed caused them to suspend operations on the Fairview Commons engagement almost immediately. Constance replaced them with a different approach. She began conducting the property inspections herself in the early mornings, accompanied by her assistant. The vehicle's monitoring system logged 11 separate approaches in a 4-day period. At 2 separate instances, between 1 and 3 in the morning, Constance was recorded using a flashlight to examine the vehicle's interior through the window. I am going to be direct about what this means. A private citizen examining the interior of a federal narcotics task force vehicle at 2 in the morning, documenting the surveillance and communications equipment visible inside, is engaging in conduct that federal law takes extremely seriously regardless of their motivation. Holloway upgraded her assessment from problem to situation that requires immediate coordination. Federal legal counsel began preparing documentation. I was notified that a response was being organized and that I should not take any independent action. I did not. I waited. I documented. I called Jasmine every 3 days to check on the documentation file. I had been taught by the best documentation expert I ever knew. The kitchen table, the coffee smell. The woman who raised me and left me a house that someone was now trying to take the morning it came apart for Constance happened on a Wednesday at 7:12. Jasmine's doorbell camera, which covers the front approach to Grandma's property, recorded the full sequence. Constance arrived in her Range Rover with a man driving a tow truck, cash transaction, no paperwork. She used bolt cutters on my security chain. The tow truck driver looked at the federal law enforcement decals on the vehicle, looked at the equipment visible through the windows, and refused to proceed. His exact words, captured on audio: "Lady, this is government tagged. I'm not going anywhere near this." Constance argued with him for 6 minutes. He left. She did not have the vehicle. But she had cut the chain, attempted to direct the removal of federal government property, and done all of it while being recorded on 3 separate camera systems: Jasmine's doorbell, a neighbor's porch camera, and the vehicle's own external surveillance system, which had activated at the first approach. Jasmine called me. I was already awake. I called Holloway. Holloway had already received the vehicle's automated alert. The federal marshals were dispatched within 20 minutes. Constance then made the decision that elevated this from attempted theft to obstruction of federal law enforcement. She returned to the community gate. The HOA maintains a vehicle gate at the development entrance, and changed the access code, locking the gate in a configuration that would prevent emergency vehicles or law enforcement from entering. When Federal Marshal Diane Torres arrived and found the gate blocked, and when Constance appeared and stated that she did not recognize federal authority over HOA private property and that any law enforcement access would require HOA approval first, she was not making a legal argument. She was constructing a federal obstruction charge in real time, in front of a marshal who had been doing this work for 16 years. Torres later told Jasmine that in 16 years, she had never had a target help her build the case this efficiently. I landed stateside 4 days later. Jasmine met me at Grandma's house, and the first thing I noticed was that the kitchen smelled like it always had. That specific combination of the old wood and whatever Jasmine had cooked. The second thing I noticed was the stack of folders on the kitchen table. Jasmine had been building the file for 2 months. What it contained went considerably beyond the original parking dispute. The HOA financial records she had obtained showed 3 years of consulting payments to a company called Prior Advisory Services. Total amount, $167,000. Prior Advisory Services was registered to Constance's daughter. The payments had no corresponding deliverables documented in the HOA records. No competitive bidding, no member vote authorizing the engagement, no disclosure to the board that the contracted party was related to the board president. In this state, HOA board members carry fiduciary duty to the membership, the same legal standard as corporate directors. You cannot authorize payments to family members' companies without disclosure and competitive process. When you do, you are personally liable for every dollar transferred. There was more. Cross-referencing the financial records with the property violation history, Jasmine had identified a pattern. The families receiving the highest volume of violation citations corresponded almost precisely with a list of properties that a regional development company had expressed interest in acquiring. That development company's state filings listed Constance's husband as a minority stakeholder. The citations were not about community standards. They were about property values and acquisition strategy, making targeted residents' lives difficult enough that they would sell at prices that would be favorable to a development deal that would benefit the whole president's household. Jasmine had been sitting with this information for 3 weeks, waiting for me to come home. I forwarded everything to Captain Holloway that evening. Holloway forwarded it to the federal prosecutors who were already building the obstruction case. The prosecutor's response, documented in a communication Holloway shared with me, described the financial fraud material as significantly expanding the scope of the matter. What happened next happened quickly by federal standards, which still means it took several months. I am going to describe the outcome rather than the procedural steps, because the outcome is what matters. Constance Prior was charged with theft of federal government property, obstruction of federal law enforcement, filing false statements with federal agencies. She had submitted a complaint claiming I was operating an unauthorized commercial enterprise from the property, which federal agents had investigated and found to be entirely fabricated embezzlement of HOA funds and civil rights conspiracy under federal statute for the systematic targeting of military families. Her husband was charged separately with securities fraud related to the development company disclosures. The private security company faced federal investigation for their documentation of classified government equipment. The plea agreement Constance eventually accepted involved 6 years in federal prison, full restitution to the HOA membership for the embezzled funds, permanent prohibition from serving as an officer of any homeowner association, and cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the development company's acquisition activities in 3 counties. The federal judge's comment at sentencing, and I have read the transcript several times, addressed the military family targeting specifically. The judge said that using an HOA governance position to systematically harass military families and their relatives represented a calculated exploitation of their reduced ability to defend themselves, and that the sentence reflected not merely the financial crimes, but the specific selection of people in military service as targets. I thought about Grandma's kitchen table when I read that. Jasmine became interim HOA president by unanimous acclamation at an emergency meeting attended by nearly every Fairview Commons homeowner. Her first 3 actions were to freeze the accounts pending an independent audit, publish the full financial records to every member, and contact the 4 military families who had been systematically cited to formally apologize on behalf of the association. The audit recovered the embezzled funds through Constance's personal assets, which were seized in the federal proceeding. The HOA's reserve fund, which had been depleted to cover the fraudulent consulting payments, was restored to full health within 14 months. Jasmine rewrote the bylaws with a property rights attorney's help. The new governing documents include specific protections for military and law enforcement personnel, transparent competitive bidding requirements for any contract over $500, mandatory financial disclosure for any board member whose family has a financial interest in any entity receiving HOA funds, and a recall petition process that requires only 20% of homeowners down from the previous 40% that had effectively made board accountability impossible. Those bylaws have since been adopted by 3 other HOA communities in the county after Jasmine was invited to present them at a regional property management conference. Here is what I want you to take from this, because it is more important than the story itself. An HOA board president used fabricated rules, financial fraud, and political connections to wage a coordinated campaign against military families because she calculated correctly, based on the situations she had successfully run this against before, that deployed service members and their families were the people least able to mount an effective defense. Distance, limited communication, legal unfamiliarity, emotional vulnerability about property that represented family legacy, these were the vulnerabilities she was exploiting. She was right about the vulnerabilities. She was catastrophically wrong about one thing. She assumed that being far away meant being powerless. She did not account for the possibility that the person she was targeting had spent years learning how institutions work, had a sister who knew how to build an evidentiary record, had access to federal legal resources she had never considered, and happened to park a government vehicle in his inherited driveway that carried enough federal identification to make her attempted theft into something that reached 3 agencies before her coffee was cold. But here is the version of this that does not require a federal task force vehicle. Jasmine won this case before the bolt cutters ever came out. She won it the day she went to the county records office and requested the original HOA bylaws. She won it when she started photographing comparative violations. She won it when she filed the certified mail request for financial records. She won it by building documentation the way our grandmother taught both of us to approach any problem worth solving completely, in order with patience. The federal crimes were the accelerant. The documentation was the foundation. I am back home now. Grandma's house still smells like it always has. The garden she planted for 37 years is still there. The kitchen table where she taught me things is still there. The bolt cutters Constance used are currently listed as evidence in a federal case file. The Jeep is parked in the driveway. Nobody has mentioned it. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. If you are a military family dealing with HOA harassment, the comments section of this video is watched by people who can point you toward resources. Drop your story. Drop your flag. Tell me where you're watching from. Grandma was right about the bullies.